There is one man in history who can say a specific sentence and mean it literally, not spiritually, not as a figure of speech, as a matter of Roman criminal procedure recorded in all 4 Gospels. Jesus died in my place. His name was Barabbas, and here is the detail almost no one knows. We have no idea what happened to him. None, not one word. Scripture goes silent the second the chains come off. Josephus never mentions him. No Roman record names him. No early Christian writer claims to know. The one man who was physically, bodily exchanged for Jesus of Nazareth walks out of that courtyard and out of history in the same step. Every single story you have ever heard about what became of Barabbas, that he repented, that he followed, that he stood at the foot of the cross, was invented. I am going to show you exactly where those stories came from and when. But before any of that, there is something in the oldest manuscripts of Matthew that changes the entire scene, and most Bibles today put it in a footnote where nobody reads it. The crowd that morning was not choosing between Jesus and Barabbas. They were choosing between 2 men named Jesus. Start with the name, because the name is not a name. Barabbas is Aramaic. Bar means son. Abba means father. Bar-Abba, son of the Father. That is not a personal name. It is a patronymic, a description of whose son he was, which means Barabbas is what people called him, not what his mother called him. Somewhere behind it there was a given name, the way Bar-Jonah sat behind Simon, and Bar-Timaeus sat behind the blind man at Jericho. And in part of the manuscript tradition, we have it. Matthew chapter 27, verse 16. Most modern translations read a notorious prisoner called Barabbas, but a family of early manuscripts, including the Caesarean text and the Codex Corridetti, reads something longer. A notorious prisoner called Jesus Barabbas. Jesus Barabbas. And 2 verses later, when Pilate puts the question to the crowd, that same manuscript family gives us the sentence, as it would actually have been shouted across that courtyard. Which one do you want me to release to you? Jesus Barabbas, or Jesus who is called Messiah? If this is the kind of detail you want more of, subscribe. We are going through every person in the trial of Jesus one at a time, and the next one is already scheduled. Now, is that reading authentic? I want to be careful, because this matters, and you deserve the honest version, rather than the exciting one. The evidence in favor is unusually strong for a variant this small. Origen, writing in the 3rd century, knew manuscripts that said Jesus Barabbas, and he argued against the reading, on the grounds that no sinner in the whole of Scripture is ever named Jesus. That is a theological objection, not a textual one. And in text criticism, that is exactly the kind of objection that gets a reading quietly removed. There is a principle scholars use for this. When 2 readings compete, the more difficult one is usually older. Nobody adds the name Jesus to a murderer. Plenty of people would remove it. So a significant number of textual scholars think Jesus Barabbas is original, and several major modern translations put it in the main text or a prominent footnote. It is not certain, but it is far from fringe. And there is a piece of background that makes the whole thing far less surprising than it sounds. Jesus was one of the most common male names in 1st century Judea. The Greek Jesus renders the Hebrew Yeshua, a shortened form of Yehoshua, Joshua. It carried the meaning the Lord saves. and it was attached to one of the founding heroes of the nation, the man who took Israel into the land. Parents used it constantly. We can actually count. Studies of the names inscribed on Jerusalem ossuaries and recorded in the documents of the period consistently place Yeshua among the half-dozen most common male names of the era. Josephus alone refers to something like 20 different men named Jesus. There is a Jesus son of Damnaeus and a Jesus son of Gamaliel, both of whom held the high priesthood within a generation of the crucifixion, which explains the phrasing in the Gospels that people usually read past. Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus who is called Messiah. Those are not titles of honor. They are disambiguators. They are there for the same reason your phone has more than one contact with a qualifier after the first name. So a condemned insurgent named Jesus, known publicly by his patronymic because there were too many Jesuses to keep track of, is not an extraordinary coincidence at all. It is exactly what you would expect, which is part of why the reading is credible. And if it is right, the scene changes completely. Because now Pilate is standing in front of a crowd, holding up two men with the same first name, and the only thing separating them is the second half. Jesus, Son of the Father, and Jesus, called the Messiah. Now the second thing everyone gets wrong. Barabbas was not a thief. The King James Version calls him a robber, and that word has stuck for 400 years. It has given us a Barabbas who picks pockets and steals purses, a common criminal, so that the crowd's choice looks merely stupid. The Greek word John uses is lestes, and we know exactly how that word was being used in first-century Judea, because Josephus uses it constantly, and he never once means a pickpocket. In Josephus, lestes is the standard word for an insurgent. A guerrilla, an armed man in the hills, fighting Roman occupation, who funded himself by raiding, and who Rome classified as a bandit precisely because Rome would not dignify him with the word soldier. 2 chapters later in the crucifixion account, the two men crucified beside Jesus are called by the same word. Rome did not crucify shoplifters. Crucifixion was the punishment reserved for sedition, rebellion, and slave revolt. It was a political execution, designed to be watched. And Mark, who is usually the sparest of the four, gives us the sentence that settles it. Mark chapter 15, verse 7. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder in the insurrection. Read that slowly, because there are 3 separate pieces of information packed into it. First, he was in prison with others. This was not one man acting alone. This was a group. Second, they had committed murder in the insurrection. Not murder in the course of a robbery, murder in the course of an uprising. Third, and this is the detail that historians grab onto, Mark writes the insurrection. The definite article, not an insurrection, the one. Mark expects his readers to know which one he means. We do not know which one he meant. That specific event has not survived in any other source, but the way Mark writes it tells us it was recent, it was in Jerusalem, and everybody reading his account in the 1st century knew the reference without being told. Luke agrees. Chapter 23, verse 19. Thrown into prison for an insurrection in the city and for murder. So here is the man in the cell, not a burglar, an armed rebel, taken alive after a failed uprising in Jerusalem, held with his surviving comrades, awaiting execution by crucifixion, which is precisely why there were 3 crosses ready that morning, and only one of them ended up used by somebody else. Those crosses were not for Jesus. 2 of them held Barabbas's men. The middle one was his. To understand what that courtyard actually was, you need to understand what an insurrection meant in Judea, because this was not an isolated act of violence. It was a condition. Rome had annexed Judea in the year 6, and the first thing it did was run a census for taxation. A Galilean named Judas raised a revolt against it. Josephus describes his movement as a distinct philosophy, a faction that held it was a sin against God to pay tribute to Caesar because God alone was king. That revolt was crushed. The idea was not. For the next 60 years, Judea produced a continuous low-grade insurgency. Armed groups in the hills, ambushes on roads, assassinations in crowds. Rome answered with mass crucifixions along the highways. Josephus records 2,000 at once in a single suppression. Every generation in Judea had seen a line of crosses along a road. Barabbas came out of that world, which means the crowd in that courtyard was not looking at a monster. Depending on who you asked, they were looking at a man who had done what the Psalms and the prophets seemed to demand, taken up a weapon against the empire, occupying the land God had given them. Now the custom. All 4 Gospels say Pilate had a practice of releasing one prisoner at the festival. Matthew 27, verse 15. At the festival, the governor had a custom of releasing a prisoner chosen by the crowd. And I have to be straight with you here, because this is the single most disputed detail in the whole account. There is no record of that custom anywhere outside the New Testament. No Roman law describes an annual Passover amnesty in Judea. No Jewish source mentions it. Josephus, who documents Pilate's administration in detail and does not like him, never refers to it. That silence is a real problem, and I am not going to talk around it. But here is what we do know, and it is more than nothing. Roman governors held a power called abolitio, the authority to dismiss charges before a verdict. It was real, it was routine, and it was entirely at the governor's discretion. And there is a surviving document that shows it working exactly the way the Gospels describe. It is a papyrus from Roman Egypt, from around the year 85, recording a hearing before the governor, Gaius Septimius Vegatus. The governor tells the accused, "You deserved a flogging, but I give you to the crowds. I give you to the crowds." That is a Roman official, in a Roman province, on an ordinary administrative day, releasing a prisoner as a concession to public opinion, and saying so in those words. So the honest position is this: an annual, formalized Passover amnesty is not documented. A Roman governor releasing a prisoner to please a volatile crowd at a dangerous moment is entirely documented, and Passover in Jerusalem was the single most dangerous week on the calendar. Whether Pilate did it every year, or did it that once, the maneuver fits everything we know about how he governed. So picture the courtyard. It is early. The sky is barely gray. Pilate is on the judgment platform, which the Gospels call the pavement. He has a prisoner in front of him that he does not want to execute. All 4 Gospels record him trying repeatedly to get out of it, and a delegation in front of him that he cannot afford to refuse. So he reaches for a lever. He has a condemned insurgent in a cell 20 meters away, who is genuinely dangerous, genuinely guilty, and genuinely hated by the same aristocracy, standing in front of him. A rebel like Barabbas threatened the priestly establishment as much as he threatened Rome. Armed uprisings brought reprisals, and reprisals landed on the temple. Pilate's calculation is obvious. Offer them the murderer. They will take the preacher's release rather than let the killer out. He gets to look generous. The problem walks away. And he never has to sign anything. He has them brought up together, and he asks the question, "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" Now hold the picture. 2 men on a Roman platform at dawn. One has been beaten through the night and has been awake for 24 hours. The other has been in a cell for weeks and has iron burns around both wrists. If the manuscripts are right, both of them answer to the name Jesus. One of them is son of the Father by patronymic. The other is son of the Father by claim. One took up a knife to free Israel. The other rode in on a borrowed donkey 5 days earlier, while people threw their coats in the road. Both of them offered deliverance. The crowd was being asked which kind they wanted. And here I have to say something plainly, because this passage has been misused for centuries, and I am not going to hand it to you the way it has usually been handed down. This was a crowd, in a courtyard, at dawn, on one morning. Matthew and Mark both state directly that the chief priests stirred up the crowd to ask for Barabbas. Mark 15, verse 11. This was an organized delegation working a gathering it had assembled. In front of a governor it was pressuring, at an hour when most of Jerusalem was still asleep. It was not a nation voting. It was not a people speaking. And within 7 weeks, according to Acts chapter 2, thousands of people in that same city, very likely including some who were standing in that courtyard, were publicly following the man they had shouted against. Anyone who has ever used this scene to indict a whole people has read it against its own text. And since we are here, I am going to deal with the hardest verse in the passage directly, because skipping it would be dishonest, and because it has done more damage than almost any other sentence in the New Testament. Matthew records that Pilate washed his hands in front of the crowd and declared himself innocent of the man's blood. And Matthew 27, verse 25, gives the answer from the courtyard. His blood be on us and on our children. That verse has been quoted for 19 centuries to justify violence against Jewish communities across Europe and beyond. Pogroms were preached from it. It was read aloud before massacres. So let me put 4 facts next to it. First, Matthew was a Jewish writer, composing a Jewish gospel for a largely Jewish Christian readership about a Jewish Messiah. He is not writing about an alien people. He is writing about his own. Second, the phrase is a formula from Jewish legal idiom used elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible when someone accepts responsibility for a verdict they believe is correct. In its own context, it means we are confident this judgment is right, and we will answer for it. It is a claim of certainty, not a curse across generations. Third, it is one crowd. Matthew is describing the people standing in a specific courtyard on a specific morning, having been assembled and prompted by a specific delegation. He is not taking a census. Fourth, and this is the one that settles it inside the text itself. In Luke chapter 23, verse 34, the man on the cross responds to the entire proceeding. The crowd, the council, the soldiers, all of it, with "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." If the central figure of the account refuses to hold it against them while it is happening to him, no one reading the account afterward has standing to. I am not going to hand you that verse without that. Nobody should. The crowd chose Barabbas. and a soldier walked down into the holding area with a key. Try to imagine being him. You have been condemned. In Roman practice, a man sentenced to crucifixion knew roughly when. You had two comrades in the same block, under the same sentence. You had counted your remaining time in hours. And then the door opens at the wrong time of day. The irons come off. Nobody explains anything, because nobody explains anything to a condemned man. And you are walked up a passage toward daylight you have not seen in weeks, and out through a gate into a street, free, cleared, no conditions. And it is worth being concrete about what that release actually was, because Roman law was not casual about paperwork. This was not a jailbreak, and it was not a pardon in the modern sense. A pardon forgives a crime that stands. What Pilate exercised was closer to abolitio. The charge itself dropped before judgment, the case dissolved rather than forgiven. Administratively, the file simply stopped existing, which produced a strange result. Barabbas did not walk out as a forgiven murderer. He walked out as a man with no case against him at all. On the record, as far as Rome was concerned, there was now nothing to answer for. Every other man in that block was still condemned. The charge that had held all of them was still valid, still being enforced, still killing his friends that same hour. It was only removed from him, and nobody told him why. That is not speculation. It is how the procedure worked. A condemned man was not consulted, briefed, or explained to. He was moved. Somewhere in that passage between the cell and the street, he would have realized he was not being taken to the execution ground, and he would have had no idea what had replaced it. And roughly 300 meters away, on a low rise just outside the city wall, Roman soldiers are already at work with 2 of your men and 1 substitute. And I want you to notice who else was up on that hill, because this connection is almost never made, and it is sitting in the text in plain sight. Matthew 27, verse 38. 2 rebels were crucified with him, 1 on his right and 1 on his left. The word Matthew uses there is lestai, the plural of the exact word John used for Barabbas. Same word, same charge, same mourning, same execution detail. Those 2 men are almost certainly Barabbas's comrades. The ones Mark told us were in prison with him, condemned for murder committed in the same uprising. There were 3 crosses prepared that day, because there were 3 condemned insurgents. 2 of them were used as planned. The middle one had been built for Barabbas. And that means the arrangement on that hill was not a random grouping of criminals. It was one broken cell of an insurgency, with a substitute in the center position that their leader was supposed to occupy. Now go to Luke chapter 23. One of those 2 men spends his last hours mocking the man in the middle. The other one turns on him. We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong. Read that as the sentence of an insurgent, because that is who is saying it. He is not making a general observation about sin. He is a convicted rebel stating from a cross that his own conviction was correct, and the man beside him does not belong there. And then he asks for something almost absurdly modest. Remember me when you come into your kingdom. The answer is immediate. Today you will be with me in paradise. So hold the whole shape of that morning in one frame. 3 men were condemned for the same uprising. One of them was released and walked into a city, free, guilty, and asked for nothing. One of them was crucified, asked for one thing, and was given more than he asked for. And the third one mocked, and Luke records no answer at all. Same cell, same charge, same sentence. 3 completely different endings, all of them decided in the space of about 6 hours, and none of them earned. Did he watch? I do not know. Nobody knows. That is not a dramatic pause. It is the actual state of the evidence. The Gospels drop him the instant he is released. Matthew, he released Barabbas to them. Mark, he released Barabbas. Luke, he released the man who had been thrown into prison. John does not even give him a verb. The account simply moves on. 4 writers, 4 bare clauses, and then nothing. No follow-up, no later appearance, not a word, and it stays nothing. Josephus is silent. The Roman records are silent. Paul never mentions him. The Church Fathers never claim to know. In 2,000 years of Christian writing, not one early source preserves a tradition about what became of Barabbas. Now, you have almost certainly heard otherwise. So let me tell you exactly where those stories come from, because knowing this is worth more than the stories. The version where Barabbas converts and becomes a follower comes overwhelmingly from a novel. Barabbas, by the Swedish writer Per Lagerkvist, published in 1950. It won him the Nobel Prize in Literature the following year. And it is a genuinely serious book. Lagerkvist's Barabbas spends his whole life unable to believe and unable to walk away, which is far more interesting than the version most people repeat. Then, in 1961, it became a film with Anthony Quinn. And that film is where most of the popular images come from. Barabbas at the foot of the cross, Barabbas in the arena, Barabbas dying a believer. None of that is history. It is fiction, and Lagerkvist never pretended otherwise. There are also scattered medieval legends, and they contradict each other, which is what medieval legends about undocumented people always do. Let me ask you something, and I would honestly like to read your answers on this one. Do you think Barabbas ever found out who took his place? Not whether he converted, just whether he ever learned the name of the man who died on the cross that had been built for him. Tell me in the comments. What we can do, carefully and without inventing anything, is describe the world he walked back into. Because the insurgency Barabbas belonged to did not stop that morning. It intensified. Josephus describes a group that emerged in the following decades called the Sicarii, the dagger men, named for the short curved blade they carried under their cloaks. Their method was assassination in crowds. They would move up beside a target in a festival throng, use the knife, and join the shouting. Judea went from that to open war. In the year 66, the province rose against Rome. In 70, the temple burned. In 73, the last holdouts died at Masada. Every road Barabbas could have walked down after his release led into that. If he stayed in the movement, the odds are overwhelming that he died the way his comrades died that Friday, on a cross, or in the siege, or in the ruins. Rome crucified insurgents by the thousand during the war. Josephus says they ran out of wood. So the most probable ending is the plainest and the least satisfying one. The man who was released instead of Jesus was very likely crucified by Rome anyway, a few years later, for exactly the same charge, and nobody wrote it down. But I want to be clear that this is a probability drawn from context, not a record. The record says nothing. There is one other possibility worth naming, and it is quieter. He could have stopped. A man who has been condemned has counted his last hours, and then walks free by an accident he had no part in, does not always go back to the hills. Some of them go home. Some of them find a trade in another town, and never say the name they were known by. The Judean countryside in the 30s was full of villages where nobody asked what you had done before you arrived. If that is what happened, we would expect exactly what we have: silence. A man who disappears into ordinary life leaves no record, because ordinary life in the 1st century left almost no records at all. The only reason we know anything about Caiaphas or Pilate is that they held office. Barabbas held nothing. So the honest summary is that there are 2 plausible endings, and no evidence for either. He went back and died the way his friends died. Or he walked away and got old somewhere quiet, and never once mentioned it. I find I want it to be the second one. That is not history. That is me. I am telling you so you can discount it. Now put Barabbas beside the others in this story, and look at what each one left behind. Caiaphas left an ossuary, an ornate limestone box, with his family name scratched into the side, found under a Jerusalem hillside in 1990. Pilate left an inscription, a block of limestone recovered at Caesarea in 1961, bearing his name and his title, cut into stone while he was still in office. Annas left a dynasty that Josephus documents across 60 years. Judas left a field. Acts and Matthew both name it, and the site south of Jerusalem has carried the name for 2,000 years. Even the unnamed centurion left a sentence that has been quoted every year since. Barabbas left nothing: no box, no stone, no field, no tradition, no grave. Not even a first name that everyone agrees on. If you want the next one, and the next one is the trial almost nobody counts, subscribe now, so it comes to you when it goes up. And there is one more shape in this that I want to put in front of you carefully, because it is striking and because it is easy to overstate. Open Leviticus chapter 16. It describes the ritual of the Day of Atonement. The high priest takes 2 goats. They are presented together at the entrance of the tent, and lots are cast over them. One lot falls for the Lord, the other falls for Azazel. The first goat is killed. Its blood is taken inside, past the curtain, into the Holy of Holies, the one place on the one day that the high priest is permitted to enter. The second goat is not killed. The high priest lays both hands on its head, confesses the guilt of the people over it, and it is led out of the camp and released alive into the wilderness. 2 animals, presented side by side, chosen between. One dies carrying the guilt. One walks away carrying it and lives. Now I have to be careful, and I want you to hold me to this. That ritual belongs to Yom Kippur, not Passover. These are different feasts, months apart, with different theology and different requirements. Nothing in the gospel account says Pilate was performing a ritual, and Pilate certainly had no idea what the Day of Atonement was. So this is not a designed parallel. It is not prophecy fulfilled in the way that phrase usually gets thrown around. If anyone tells you Barabbas was the scapegoat as a matter of established doctrine, they are going further than the text goes. But the resonance is there, and it is not nothing, and serious readers have noticed it for a very long time. 2 figures presented together at a threshold, a choice made over them. One dies. The other is released, alive, carrying guilt that was never lifted from him. Whatever you decide that is, deliberate design, or the same pattern surfacing twice because the pattern was always the point. It happened in a courtyard in front of a Roman administrator who thought he was managing a crowd. And here is what I think that silence is actually telling us, and it took me a while to see it. Every other person in this story is remembered for what they did with the moment. Caiaphas calculated. Pilate hesitated. Judas broke. Peter denied and came back. Each of them is a study in response. Barabbas did not respond to anything. He was asleep in a cell. He didn't know a trial was happening. He did not know his name was being shouted in a courtyard. He did not petition, argue, repent, believe, or ask. He was simply told to stand up, and the door was open. The substitution happened to a man who was not participating in it. That is why the record is empty. And I think that is the point rather than the gap. Every other figure in the Passion narrative shows you something about how a person answers God. Barabbas is the only one who shows you what the exchange looks like, with the person removed from the equation entirely. He is not there as an example. He is there as evidence. There is a version of Christianity that quietly runs on a ledger. You know the one, where grace is real, but you sense there is a threshold, where forgiveness is offered, but you keep a running account of whether you have been sincere enough, sorry enough, changed enough to have actually qualified for it. Barabbas is the demolition of that ledger, and that is exactly why he is uncomfortable. He was guilty, not accused, guilty. Mark says murder, and Mark does not soften things. He had done it. He had been caught. He had been condemned by a court that got the verdict right. He did not repent to get out. He did not believe to get out. He was not sorry as far as anyone recorded. He was in a cell with iron on his wrists when someone else was nailed to the wood with his name on it. And he walked. The exchange was not a reward for his response. It happened first. Whatever he did afterward, and we have no idea what he did afterward, happened on the other side of a door that was already open. That is either the best news in the world or an offense, depending on how much you have invested in the ledger. The man had nothing to bring. He was not even awake for it. That is what took his place. If this reached something in you, do one thing with it. Think of someone who has decided they are too far gone, someone who believes there is a threshold of sincerity they have never managed to clear, who keeps trying to earn their way back to a door that is already standing open. Someone who thinks grace is a transaction they keep failing to complete. Send them this one, not a sermon, just the story of a guilty man who did absolutely nothing and walked out anyway and never even knew what it cost. And there is a piece of that morning that almost nobody counts. Between Caiaphas and Pilate, Jesus was sent to a fourth court, to a king who had been wanting to meet him for months, purely out of curiosity. The Gospels say he asked question after question and got no answer at all. Not one word. He had already executed one prophet, Herod Antipas. That story is next. May the God who opened a cell door for a man who never asked and who never required him to deserve it first, open whatever you have been standing behind, waiting to be good enough to leave. The exchange has already happened. The account was settled without your signature on it.